Barbizon is a village. It's a small village on the edge of the forest of Fontainebleau, which is 37 miles southeast of Paris. And it's a place where this was the generation of artists who had been, excuse me, doing the wrong thing there, who had been very influenced, had seen Constable's work and were very impressed by it. And it influenced all these painters. And you'll see how in just a second. Sorry, I'm distracting myself here. Here we go. So this is Corot, who was the oldest of the Barbizon painters and actually began independently of them. He started painting quite late because he was the son of quite an affluent family in Paris whose business was haberdashery, and his father wanted him to work in the family business. And it was only at 26 he said to his father, "I can't do this. I want to paint." And his father allowed him to. And his sister died the next year, at which point the father gave him an allowance which was sufficient for him to just paint. But he was a very shy and gentle person who, apart from when he took long trips, lived with his parents until they died, and actually would ask permission to go out at night up until his parents died and he was independent of them. But so he began painting. This is a painting he did around 27, and it's just one of his first efforts. He studied with a couple of artists for a year or two, and then his parents gave him the money to go to Italy, which is what all artists did in those days. And he spent 4 years in Italy the first time. And he came, though he didn't actually spend very much time studying Italian artwork. He spent most of his time painting the countryside around Rome and hanging out with other young French artists who were doing the same thing. And they were all influenced by an artist who was, at this point, was gone, but a very famous classical landscape artist who spent 20 years painting in Italy before he developed larger, ambitious works. And he wrote a thesis on which he called Reflections and Advice to a Student of Painting, particularly on landscape, which was very influential at the time, and all of them would have read it. And he advised painters to work from life, do small studies from life, and to paint at different times of day the same subject, to become very, very familiar with subjects, and to keep the paintings loose and reflective of the real circumstances. And he saw these as a tool, as material for much bigger, ambitious historical paintings. And in fact, it's only in the early 20th century that his studies were discovered. And they're now esteemed much more than his ambitious classical work. There's just a couple of his works, and I show you to give you an idea of what he was doing and how it influenced people like Corot. Now, this painting by Corot in the countryside in Italy is really does prefigure Impressionism. His Italian colors were much more brilliant than his later work. And this, I think, is a magnificent painting. He actually did this view at several different times of day. And these paintings were not as much sketches as what Valenciennes would do. He carried these to completion over several days, though they're quite small. He also painted quite a number of figure paintings of Italians, especially young Italian women. And this is, I think, is quite a beautiful one.
What is that thing that?
She's that's a spindle.
Oh,
She's spinning.
oh, okay.
Now he took another trip a few years later, shorter trip, and this is one of the works from that trip. He would return altogether. He had 3 trips to Italy, and Italy had an immense effect on the way he saw the world and the way he painted. This was he like all of the Barbizon painters, he would have a lot of time being accepted by the Academy. This was the first painting that the Academy really liked. And he'd already been painting for more than a decade at this point. No, actually, it's even longer than that, about 15, 20 years. It's Hagar in the wilderness when she was abandoned with Ishmael, and they're starving in the wilderness, and an angel comes and saves them. Biblical story. But the Academy really liked this because there was such a unity between the story and the figures and the landscape. And of course, the landscape is very much based on landscapes he painted in Italy. This is quite a large painting. But after that, they didn't like his paintings again. And it took him many years to gain acceptance by the Academy. His studies of figures, especially young women, are quite beautiful. At this point, he's also gone to the village of Barbizon to paint, and met the other artists who are working there, and they kind of work together now. And one of them is Millet, who I won't talk about tonight, but if you probably know, Millet focused on peasants. So you can see Millet's influence in this painting of a peasant. But quite a stunning portrait, I think. And more paintings of peasants in the fields. And back in Italy, his 3rd trip to Italy, and I think just a marvelous landscape, which really conveys the hill towns of Italy beautifully. And you can see his very loose brushwork, which is one of the things. The Barbizon painters, as they developed, became the foundation on which the Impressionists built, and the Impressionists got to know them quite well. This is Montmartre. It's the windmill in Montmartre, which figures in a lot of paintings, including one by Van Gogh. But you can see here, as he develops, his colors actually generally become less dramatic, and he's relying on value, on light and dark, and he had perfect pitch when it came to value, so that he could do the most amazing things with actually very restrained palettes. This is interesting. It's a portrait of a young Italian patriot in the forests. Done in 43. In 48, the Italian patriots rebelled throughout Italy in an attempt to unify Italy, which was a complete failure. But the leaders were the people the carboniere, the people who created carbon in the forest. They had a network throughout Italy, and they led this rebellion. But it's a very, very good painting, and it shows he was not that obviously political, but it shows his political sympathies. Because, you know, France at this time was in constant political turmoil. There was a revolution in 30, there was a revolution in 48, there was another one in 70, which was disastrous with the with the Paris Commune. This is the way he develops. So as he begins to become very famous after about 1848, the 1848 rebellion, the Academy opens up, but also Delacroix and the writer Baudelaire come to his defense, as they would the other Barbizon painters, and start broadcasting their respect for them and agitating for them to be allowed into the Academy, which works. So Corot becomes eventually very well established, and his work is selling for an enormous amount of money. But he was a very modest person, and he was incredibly generous with his money. He actually he gave he bought a house from Millet in Auvers-sur-Loise, which we'll talk about more in a minute, because Millet had gone blind and he had nowhere to live. And he gave also, no, I'm sorry. Let me look that up, because I think I have something wrong there. Just a second. He yeah, he gave, it was, I'm sorry, he bought a house for Daumier, and he gave Millet's wife a huge amount of money. And he also gave a small fortune to the Paris Commune, even though he was not directly involved in it. But his painting became a little bit more formularized, very beautiful, but less direct. And in that way, he that refinement separates him actually from the rest of the Barbizon painters. And he also adapted his work to fit more into the Academy, doing these more classical scenes with nudes, which are not my favorite of his work at all, though they're quite well done. I like this one a lot. I think it has a very strong feeling to it. But this is the direction his work moves towards the end of his career. And the problem with this work is it was very easy for people to produce forgeries of this particular style. And he was also very careless. He would sign copies of his work done by students and friends. And so by the time he died, there were hundreds or maybe thousands of copies of his work floating around, which made it very hard to figure out what was his and what was, actually a forgery or a copy. But he continued to make these just stunning portraits. This is an Italian woman. And this is the last painting I'm showing of his. What's interesting about this is it's supposed to be actually Bornova, Izmir in Turkey. Now, Corot never went to Turkey, so I'm not quite sure where he gathered the information for this. But it's much more in line with the kind of work that Delacroix would have done. So there's one of the other Barbizon painters, and maybe the most unusual of them, who I was not that aware of before, is Theodore Rousseau, who has sort of a tragic life. but is a very interesting figure. He's sort of a pantheist. He absolutely loved and worshipped trees. But a good painter. This is early in his life. He never left France, as far as I know, and this is in southern France. It's actually well, I don't know where it is actually, but this is a fishing village, and you can see his wonderful handling of paint, but also a certain darkness to his palette. He's not as interested in sunlight effects as the other painters. And he loved trees. So he loved trees, the distraction. So something like this would have upset him, just seeing all the cut up trunks of trees. And there's something very dramatic about the scene because of his feelings. I think it's a beautiful study.
Yes.
And in this way, he's maybe the closest in some ways to Constable. Now, this was a painting he did, which was for the Academy. It was submitted to the Academy. He'd had a number of paintings accepted, but this one was rejected, and it has suffered very badly over time because he painted on a ground which has bled through the other colors. A bitumen, which a lot of the painters were using in those days, as a brown. And so we don't know exactly what it looked like, but it's people bringing cattle out of the mountains in the autumn. And for the next 7 years, his paintings were rejected. And he got so upset that he just stopped. For 8 years, he stopped submitting work. And he became famous in a certain way for his refusal to even submit work. And I think also it contributed to the darkness of his temperament. There's something very melancholy about his work. This is I think, a dynamite painting, though. It's hoarfrost on a landscape at sunset. And really quite an amazing painting, but very melancholy. What do people think of this one?
Very moody. I love the darkness. I'm always like trying to see what's in the background, like really just trying to find details.
Yeah. The sky is so convincing, and then these touches of the hoarfrost on the plants in the foreground are really.
You can almost feel. It's almost like you're waiting for the sounds. The night sounds.
Yes.
It's very evocative.
Yeah, this is the thing about his work, is it's melancholy, dark, but incredibly compelling, I think. This was one that actually was when he finally, as with some of these other painters, he's championed by the other artists, and also again by Delacroix and Baudelaire, and the Academy begins to accept him. But his success is somewhat limited. He has enormous acceptance at the World Universal Exhibition in 1854. And he buys, oh no, that's something else. And he holds a big auction in the hope of, it was something that painters would do in those days to establish themselves. And the auction is a massive failure, which really upsets him. And this was during the period before that exposition, and this was commissioned by the state. But what's interesting is it's a view out of a forest. A lot of his paintings, he's more comfortable in the forest than out of it. And he actually built himself a portable lean-to and a special easel to paint in the woods, and would spend days and weeks working on these paintings on location. And then he would bring them to his studio and work on them for months and years more. He had a lot of trouble deciding when his work was finished. But look how you see the cattle here, how there's sort of something passing through this space, which is monumental and kind of timeless. Again, the cattle are sort of just an incidental thing passing through this very dark and powerful landscape. And this is one of my favorites, some oak trees. Well, obviously very ancient oak trees. And it's more, the subject is more the trees than anything else. So his love of trees, which actually was almost a form of worship for him, led him to get very concerned when the loggers and builders going after stones and wood in the forest began to eat away at the forest, and very near where he lived in a little cottage. So he actually wrote a letter to one of the ministers of Napoleon III, which had the effect of causing Napoleon III to set up a commission. And the commission eventually designated much of the forest as special reserve for artists and hikers. And this was the first natural reserve in the world, as far as they know. And it was a result of his activities. An unusually cheerful painting for Rousseau.
It's like a photograph.
Doesn't it? It shows you his amazing ability at depicting detail. But again, the darkness in the foreground he has to always have a really strong element of darkness in his paintings. This painting is actually shortly before his death. He had a number of things that happened late in life. His wife's mental health got really bad. A friend committed suicide in his cottage. He went sketching in the mountains and got extremely ill. He got disappointed over the denial of a number of awards, got sick, paralyzed, and died in the presence of Millet. Millet was there at his deathbed. So he died at 55. But I think this is quite a stunning painting. It's so austere. And look at the little figure there, which is obviously only there to give you some sense of the scale of these trees.
It's amazing how he gets so much texture and very
Yes.
colors. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, there's a lot of, apparently when you study these paintings up close, there's an amazing amount of variation in the color, even though it's very tight, you know. A lot is lost in translation of his paintings.
Mm-hmm.
So, a very different personality, Charles-François Daubigny, who began actually a little like Rousseau. He comes from a very modest background. In fact, his family was quite poor. And it was a real struggle for Daubigny to even become a painter. And in the beginning, he painted very conventional, traditional landscapes. And then he ran into the Barbizon School and joined them. Well, first he met Corot and joined the Barbizon painters. And his painting completely changed. At this point, you can see, I think, he's now a member of the group, and you can see the influence of Millet, as you could a little bit in Corot's work. he's paying attention to the life of the peasants, which of course were a dying culture in France at this point. Also, if you look at this and the way the perspective moves towards the distance, you can see where Van Gogh, who worshipped Daubigny, got some of his inspiration. But he was also very romantic, quite different, much more sociable. His paintings verge on the sentimental at times, like this one, which is called Springtime, but quite beautiful. And I think actually that sentimentality, that particular kind of romanticism, really appealed to Van Gogh too. Early on, I mean, he acquired a boat, which he called Le Botin, excuse me. And this is a sketch. I don't know if it's by him or by a friend, but they've obviously finished painting, and it looks like they're drinking right from a small cask of wine here. Note the fish. The fish obviously want to drink too. And something's cooking over here. But he would use the boat to travel up and down the Seine and paint views along the water's edge. And later he would take the boat up a tributary, which is the Loise, and eventually he bought a house in Auvers-sur-Loise, right near the water, and continued to use the boat. But if you remember that name, Auvers-sur-Loise, that's where Van Gogh ends up. And he's there for a reason. It was a place that a lot of painters gathered after, you know, the Barbizon, a lot of the Barbizon painters actually ended up gathering in Auvers-sur-Loise. Now this, I think, is an amazingly good, well, and beautifully executed painting. And it actually suggests the work of Manet to me a little bit in its simplicity and its emphasis on value with just a very limited palette. And here, I mean, this might as well be an Impressionist painting. Of course, at this point, the Barbizons and the young Impressionists, because they're still quite young, are hanging out a lot. Actually, Daubigny, apart from meeting Corot in 1850, in 1870, he's in London partly because of the Franco-Prussian War, and he meets Monet, who's also there. And he introduces him actually to his dealer, Durand Ruel, who would end up becoming the dealer for all the Impressionists and making their success, actually. But this is a lovely impression of a sunset. It's just gorgeous, I think. Again, quite a restrained palette here. At this point, this is very late in his life, a year before his death. And it shows how much the young Impressionists are now influencing him. So I thought I would show you this one painting because it's Van Gogh's homage to Daubigny. Daubigny, at the point that Van Gogh painted this, has been dead for about 10 years. But Van Gogh, who was very aware of all the different artists because of the family being in the art business, would have been aware of Daubigny for many years. And his widow was still living in the house. So I will cover the other major member of the Barbizon School, Millet, and then I'll include him with Daumier, because they're both they were both the most socially conscious of these artists of this generation. But the other thing I think you get from looking at the Barbizon painters is realizing that the Impressionists didn't come out of nowhere. They are very much something that is rooted in this ground that the Barbizon painters cultivated. And do any of you have? I'm trying, by the way, to make these presentations a little bit shorter. But anyone, any feedback from any of you on what we saw?
I really like the gobo